Now we're going to take a look at manipulating and planting of 3D objects. So I'm going to go over to planting. Now it's pretty similar to 2D, but there are a couple of differences. One of the first is rotating. You can obviously rotate a 3D object, which you can't do with a 2D. If I just plant a building, you can plant either on the top view or again in the perspective view. So we'll click plant, and usually to rotate you'll be wanting to rotate on the Z-axis, because if you imagine a line from top to bottom through the object, that's the Z-axis. So although it seems a little illogical sometimes when you're wanting to rotate it on the top view, to select the Z-axis, that's the one you need. So I sometimes rotate in the top view, sometimes on the perspective view, but normally obviously the top view is set to XY, so you'll need to flip it over to Z if you want to rotate it on this axis. And we can turn it around any position we want. Scale and move are pretty much the same as they were in the 2D objects. The only difference is on scale you can't actually type in a size to scale it to. You have to just drag it and use your eyes. So what I tend to do is, if I'm planting a building, is to plant a person. So if I was planting this building, for instance, I would go to the People tab and select a person, and I'd just plant a person near a door. That way, when I scale it, I can check that it's the right size for the person, and then everything will be in the correct scale. So that's how I set my scale of my buildings. If you know the scale you want before you plant it, obviously you can set that in the planting. There's still the option to type in a size, and you can lock it if you just want to set size for those buildings at all times. You can lock it and it'll be ready the next time you want to plant that building. It will still be set to the same size. Now if you move it along the terrain, it will do the same as the 2D objects did that had the planting marker, the depth marker, but there is no marker on the 3D. It's built into the objects themselves, so you can't actually see it or change it. But if you drag the 3D object on the XY up a hill, it will still go up the hill and stay planted on the ground. One difference though is, when you save it, it will update the depth, unlike the 2D where we had to manually move it to get it to update it. It will actually move with the land moving. So if we raise or lower the ground, the object will automatically, the next time you validate and save, will move as well, which is handy because it means we haven't got to do anything. But it does mean if you want to adjust the height, sometimes you're on a side of a hill, say, and obviously the building's horizontal, so part of the building, if you're on a slope, one corner of your building is going to be in the air, so you either need to flatten your ground or lower your building or raise your ground up. Now if you raise the ground up, because it will automatically adjust the building height, the depth, when you validate and save, what you'll find is you move the terrain up to beautifully match the building. Then you'll save it, and then next time you come to play, it'll be floating in the air again, because it will have auto moved because you moved the terrain. So you need to move the 3D down rather than the terrain up to make sure that doesn't happen. But obviously with a building, it's best for the most part to flatten the land first. Just add some verts around. If you just add a ring of verts around the outside of your building. I usually put 2. That way you won't get any sharp edges when you flatten it. The same as a T. If you've got another ring outside of verts, it will create a smoother slope when you flatten the inside. So that's planting them. Pretty straightforward. And manipulating, as I say, you can drag up and down 3D objects. Now, this is actually quite handy because you're very limited to the amount of stock objects you've got. Sometimes you'll find you can actually create new effects by dragging your object underground. So if I set this, for example, if we drag this down and take the first floor away, we can create a nice bungalow type effect, a little hut, and it looks totally different building, although we're using the same building. So you can do this with fences. If you've got a 3-post fence or a 2-post fence or whatever, you can drag it down and make it a 1-post fence, which I've done in the past. It's quite a useful tip. One of the other ways you can manipulate them, which really hasn't been published, I've not seen anywhere else mention it, so I don't know whether anybody actually knows you can do this, but you can also stretch the 3D objects, which I did in the first course I made. I stretched the clubhouse that I used, the house I used for the clubhouse. I actually stretched it to try and make it look unlike the original. So I'm just going to show you how to do that. I will bring this out from underground. Let's just move it onto a flat bit of ground so we can see what we're doing. Now, in order to stretch it, we need to use the constrain scale, but if we set our scale command and we set, say, the X axis, what you'll find if you try and scale it, it doesn't scale on the X axis, it just scales normally, so it looks like you can't stretch it in a certain direction. What you have to do is click and hold the mouse button on the object, and while you're still holding it, hold down the control key, and you'll see a little minus sign will appear by the white arrow, and you can then stretch the building in different directions. So I can make it a big long building. I could then switch it to the Y axis, click and hold the other control button. I could stretch it out in that direction as well, and you can change the height. So that's another way of creating objects that look a bit different from the stock objects. It's also very handy if you're planting a bridge across a piece of terrain. You won't always want to just scale it in a uniform way. You might want it wider, but you don't want it any longer because it's got to fit the gap you're trying to put it in. So it's quite handy to be able to stretch things like bridges as well. So you could also make bridges look quite different by doing this. So if I just quickly select say this arched bridge here, if we plant that down, I can create quite a different look by stretching it on the Z axis. So I'll switch it to Z, onto scale, click and hold, then hold the control down, and you'll see I could make it quite a flat bridge with a low arch, or conversely I could turn it into more of a viaduct style bridge just by stretching it in one axis. So hopefully you'll find a lot more uses for that, and it'll give you a bit more Variety with your 3D stock objects.